paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers! I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Greetings. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Keith Harmon Snow. He wrote a very shocking book called The Worst Interests of the Child, the Trafficking of Children and Parents Through U.S. Family Courts. How are you doing today, Keith?
Nick Bryant, thank you for having me on. I'm doing fine.
So, Keith, give us an overview of The Worst Interests of the Child.
Well, let's start with the title. The title is a play on, as far as a play could be, a play on the language, the best interests of the child. If people recall back in the, was it the 70s? I believe it was the 70s, might have been the 80s, when there were several films about fathers, like Dustin Hoffman played a part of a father who was denied access to his child. And this was propaganda that set the stage for the kind of things that are happening in family court today. So the worst interests of the child, the best interests of the child have become the language that's standard operating procedure for lawyers and judges and guardians ad litem and visitation supervisors. What I call the industry of the family court is the kind of language that they use to justify the decisions and the choices and the policies that they use and make to basically traffic parents and children through U.S. family courts. So it's not in the best interest of the child. For example, Yale University has several clinics, one of which was involved that I looked into for the book, The Worst Interests of the Child, which is really set around the case of Sonny Kelly and her son, Max Liberty. This came about as I've worked as an international journalist for years, and 25 years in the human rights and genocide investigations in Africa, Afghanistan, Mongolia, China, India, United States, etc. And this was not my area. I have a son and his mother, and we get along. We're not together, but we won't go through the family court, and we never did. So it's, people ask me, why did you do this? And because I was working with someone and they were telling me about this story of Sonny Kelly in Connecticut, and my eyes glazed over every time they told me parts of the story. But they were very close to the situation and they wanted me to understand it. And so one day they told me something that it was just too hysterical. And I said, that's absolutely not possible. So I decided to look into it and went down to Connecticut, tracked down the case. And then I tracked down subsequently 20 other cases in Connecticut to cross-reference and see how much the same players in the case of Sonny Kelly and versus Liberty, her husband, ex-husband, how many of the same players, judges, lawyers, visitation supervisors, visitation agencies, counselors, pediatricians might be involved in other cases. And there was so much overlap, it was astonishing to a sense of what happened to Sonny Kelly and her son Max. And at the same time, when something happens that I found in several other cases, I'll bring that into the story. But it's from the beginning to the end, it's about Sonny Kelly's case. And people, if you start, so this happens to a lot to the mothers and some of the fathers in family courts. They tell people what's going on with the family court, and people just have a cognitive dissonance. They refuse to accept what they're being told, and their eyes glass over, or they think to themselves, there's obviously something wrong with this parent. This mother must be a bad mother. Other mothers will say, she must be a bad mother. I'm a good mother. That would never happen to me, until it does. So the book is a template of what's going to happen to you if you get involved in a family court. And that's not monolithic. It doesn't happen the same in every court. It doesn't happen to the same economic classes. So the persecution of a young African-American woman will be very different, especially one who's in the inner city, for example. The persecution will be and I'm using that word very intentionally, the persecution will be very different than what happens to a very, very rich woman in, for example, Stamford, Connecticut, where some of the most egregious cases occurred against some very, very wealthy families. So it basically lays out what I call the organized crime of family court. I'm not talking about Al Capone or the modern day version of that, whether you think the Clintons are organized criminals or that other guy who was a president for a while. What's his name? I can't remember at the moment. Nobody liked him except the conservatives. What's his name? Donald Trump. If you think either of these guys is associated with organized crime, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. We could talk about that. That's a different issue. What I'm talking about is organized criminal activity, conspiracies, violations of the RICO, the Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations Act, and serious conspiracies where one or more people get together and make decisions that are against the best interests of someone. In this case, parents in family court, predominantly mothers. And so that's what the book does. I proved it to myself that it happened. I couldn't believe it. And in 3 months' time, I wrote it up, and that became The Worst Interests of the Child.
And in your book, you say this organized crime involves child psychologists, pediatricians, lawyers, judges, and police. And then you ask the question, how can the judicial branch of states like California, Connecticut, or Florida get away with trafficking children? And you also say that the worst states that you came across were California, Connecticut, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Texas. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think I would amend that comment. When I was looking into the story, I had a certain awareness about family courts. I wrote the book around 2011, maybe it was 2010. I did the investigation around 2011, 2012, and I wrote a long article that turned into the book, which was eventually published, I don't know the dates, 2015, something like that. And at that time, I had a certain awareness and a certain consciousness, which was informed by the investigation that I did, which turned into the book. Since then, I've been contacted by hundreds of, usually it's mothers, but not only mothers, who are being persecuted by family courts. They're being trafficked by family courts. They've lost everything. They've lost their children. Their children their full custody has been taken away from them and given to an individual who has a proven record of criminality or pedophilia. And since then, I've come to find out that, well, it's much more universal to other states. So Connecticut is a horrible state. Massachusetts is a bad state. Texas is a horrible state. I've been to Arizona several times now and interviewed mothers down in Arizona. I was in Oklahoma recently. There's a horrible case going on in Oklahoma, and it ain't the only one. And there's horrible cases going on in Tennessee and in Georgia. I did an interview in Georgia, and that particular interview in Georgia, which happened in February, really cracked me open to a whole new level of understanding of just how organized and violent this entire thing is. And people read that comment, or they hear that comment that you just made about how I say that judges, lawyers, visitation supervisors, physicians or pediatricians, counselors, Department of Children and Families, how all these people from all these different areas are involved. And people think, I've had people tell me this, it's not possible. We don't live in that kind of a society. We have justice. This isn't China. We have justice, and we have laws that have been put on the books to prevent that sort of thing from happening. And they say to me, you may have, I understand that there's a criminal judge here, or this judge is just outside the bounds of what should be considered to be reasonable dispensing of justice. But Keith, it just doesn't happen like that. You're a conspiracy theorist. No, my friend, I'm not. It's ugly. It's very organized. and it involves various levels of consciousness. So you may have a brand new worker to DCF who does what she's told, the Department of Children and Families, and she's told to do this, she's told to do that. If she starts to really become cognizant of the wheel of which she's now a clog, and she starts to articulate the problems that she's seeing, she will be removed, or she will, or even subconsciously, go along with what she's told, knowing that if she doesn't, she's going to lose her job. Or we may have a case like that movie I Care a Lot, which is about people being put in old folks' homes, custody. It's about a different kind of custody, and that movie is a very good template for the family courts and what's happening. And it shows you the criminality behind it, because we're talking about power and money. People in positions where they get more power and they realize they can make more money, and they have no ethics whatsoever.
Before I get into Liberty versus Liberty, which is kind of the nucleus of your book, you give a number of really egregious examples of the family courts awarding children to perpetrators. And in California, the family court awarded Rex Anderson, the daughter, even though Rex Anderson had a history of abuse. And in 2003, he pleaded no contest to various sex crimes against his daughter, including child molestation, sexual penetration of a child with a foreign object, and use of a minor to create pornography. And this was done for a number of years. And I just found that example mind-boggling, that the court would award Rex Anderson his daughter with his history.
Yeah, that's where you ask. First of all, you have to believe it. So people aren't going to believe it. First of all, they don't have any motivation to look into it. Why would they look into it? Okay, well, the cognitive dissonance, it also revolves around fear. People are terrified of pedophilia. If they are a victim or a survivor of a pedophile ring, for example, or child sexual abuse, many of them have never resolved that, and they will immediately go into a dissociated mode where they behave as if they're unable to process what you're talking about. You can't have a conversation with them. So there's that aspect of it. Then there's the parts of it where people don't want to talk about or look at pedophilia, period, but they certainly don't want to accept, acknowledge, or look at the scale and magnitude of the pedophilia or the trafficking that goes on in this country, involving powerful individuals and organizations like Department of Children and Family or the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. You have to go back and look at this. Clinton administration passed a law that incentivized the taking away of children and the profiteering off of children and mothers in particular. And then you've got,
what did that law state?
Oh, I went into it in my book a little bit, I believe, but it was something I've never really looked much more deeply into. For that, I would connect you to, for example, one of the family advocates that I work with, who, I'm sorry, off the bat, I can't contextualize it very well. So
my memory gets spotty in my old age. So
well, that's the problem, and I'm not so young. But what was your original question? Oh, the fathers' rights movement. The fathers' rights movement is very, very powerful, and there is not a comparable mothers' rights movement. There just isn't. The fathers' rights movement is an organized, very, very organized network that supports fathers in. It's basically modeled on the concept that fathers don't have rights in the family. The mother is always awarded the child, and that's absolutely not true. Well, people don't, when they say that, they don't know what they're talking about. So the fathers' rights movement's template is a little book called Screw the Bitch. And that is a nasty little piece of work that explains to them how to premeditate the separation from their ex, from their soon-to-be ex, in such a way that they gain access to everything and control over all resources, liquidation. The courts are liquidating people's financial accounts, their trust funds, their other, 501ks and that sort of thing. And the book lays out how to, and bank accounts, how to basically premeditated the destruction of your ex-wife or your soon-to-be ex-wife, and when children are involved, how to get the children. So,
well, there's the Father's Supremacy Foundation that you talk about, and it's it kind of reminds me of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. They both sold fictions, but they had tremendous. The Father's Supremacy Foundation has had tremendous sway in the media, which unfortunately doesn't surprise me all that much. Could you give us an overview of Liberty versus Liberty and the trials and tribulations of Sonny Kelly?
Sure. Just a quick commentary. I remember the name of that movie, Kramer versus Kramer, with Dustin Hoffman. And that portrays the mother as an unstable woman who, you have to take into account that we live in a violent militaristic patriarchy. And I'm not anti-gun. So women who were in that situation that she was in, the movie portrays her as emotionally and psychologically unstable. In the end, she wants her child back. And it also shows the father, which is Dustin Hoffman, being a great father to his kid. That is propaganda. It has plenty of truth in it. And the other thing you said was the media. The media, well, I mean, why doesn't the media report fairly on these things? First of all, family courts are closed to the newspapers and the TVs in all but incredibly Hollywoodized versions of legal justice. And so there's no access, no capacity to have access to them. But the media itself, how many media professionals are involved in trafficking children or pedophilia? How many are survivors that don't want to talk about it, don't want to look into it? How many are told just don't touch that subject because of, it's like other subjects that the media just doesn't touch because it's going to violate or offend, it's going to offend someone in a position of power, or just the simple argument that, the readers just don't want to talk about that and advertisers won't like it. So going back to Liberty versus Liberty, you asked me to give an overview, kind of a synopsis.
Yeah, tell us about Sonny Kelly's trials and tribulations with that case.
Sonny was as an investigative journalist and a human rights investigator myself, I approached the case with a lot of uncertainty and very, very skeptical of this mother's claims until I read the documents myself. But even having read the documents, even having read the documents myself, I still had to go back to the courts and go back to her and get clarification of what happened here, what happened here, what happened here. So in the beginning, she married this guy, and they had a happy life. But as soon as they got married, as happens with many males who in our society or in Europe, for example, it's not universal to white societies like ours in Europe, that the male will suddenly become very controlling and domineering and won't let her leave the house, won't let her have friends. You see this in certain other movies. There's a very popular one on Netflix. I can't think of the name of it. But it's true, it does happen. And so that began to happen to Sonny. This guy became very, very controlling. They had a child together. She realized that she needed to get out of the marriage at some point, but then she decided to try to make it work because they had a child. And, and they also, many victims of this kind of narcissistic criminal behavior on the part of their partner, male or female, many victims internalize the problems and start thinking to themselves, okay, maybe it's me, maybe I should do something. And they have to break out of that brainwashing that's being subjected to. So she had to go through that process, and that took several years until she finally got to the place where she realized she just had to separate from this guy who was sexually abusing their child. He was raping the child at the age of 3 or 4, I believe it started. And then she realized that in her ex's not at this point, he wasn't her ex. At some point in his custody, the child was being dragged across the rug, and she had to look into these burns on his body. And the more she raised the issue of the question of what was happening to her child by going to the doctor, Yale Clinic, for example, the more she was beaten down. And when they finally got involved with the court system, he had set himself up with the father's rights movement. So he had taken the right steps to make sure that, for example, she had to get a lawyer. So she went and interviewed all these lawyers, but he had already interviewed them, which automatically disqualifies all these great lawyers from her being able to use them. Bottom line is the lawyers are part of the problem. The lawyers are part of the system. This one case, just a quick segue, this one case in Oklahoma that I've been trying to help with, the mother has two daughters who are being trafficked sexually through some sort of a pedophile ring involving the ex-husband. More than one perpetrator, not only him, but some of his family members, but some strangers as well to the family. And what was the point I was making about that? That the more she brings to the courts, the more they oppress her and the more they take her rights away. And that happened in Sonny Kelly's case. The more she brought the evidence, just the physical evidence of injury on her son's body, the more she raised questions about that, the more the court came down on her, accusing her of making it all up. This plays into the whole parental alienation syndrome and Munchausen by proxy and all of these other psychological tools that the system has to either, which are supposed to be for the benefit of people to protect us and all that sort of thing, and or many times they're used against people, as in the case of Sonny. And so I go into that, and I go into how step by step she tried to figure out what was happening to her son, and as she questioned that, the court started to come down on her. And then they bring in all these other officials, and she thinks, okay, great. They're bringing a guardian ad litem. The guardian ad litem will be the intermediary between father and mother, and the guardian ad litem is supposed to protect the child as an independent third party. But the guardian ad litem then takes the side of the husband when he's sexually violating the child. And the mother is standing there wondering what the hell hit her. And this happened over and over and over until this guy, Kenneth Robson, got involved. And Robson is a psychologist from Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut area, or I believe it was Hartford. In any case, and Robson's role was to make the mother look crazy and steer the child's behavior in certain ways, but really make it look as if the mother was crazy, the father was okay, and there's nothing wrong with this picture. The guy was a pedophile.
Well, Dr. Robson said of Sonny Kelly, it's obvious that Sonny enjoys Max's sexualized behavior like a French whore. That is the psychologist that was supervising their case. He said that.
Yes.
Pretty mind-boggling.
The guy was a nightmare. And I interviewed him. It was like when I interviewed Ian Smith, the former white supremacist regime president, prime minister of Rhodesia, when Rhodesia went through its transformation from a white supremacist colonial society to a black liberation independent Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. When I interviewed him, it was like interviewing Robson. These guys are horrible. They don't want to admit what they've done, and you can see right through it if you have any consciousness and ethics. And that's what I found with Robson. The guy was, how many cases in Connecticut was he involved with where there was sexual predation going on, and he was supporting it, covering it up, making it possible to happen, or himself involved? That's the question I have. And Sonny brought in this expert, Eli Newberger from Boston. And Eli, she spent $20,000 or $30,000 for him. And, in the end, she's got nothing. She can't afford anybody. That was the point I was making about that case in Oklahoma. The mother now has 4 pro bono lawyers, so that you can't argue that they're in it for the money. However, they're still unwilling to buck the system. So she's still gliding along, supposedly being protected by these 4 pro bono lawyers, but they're not challenging the system that feeds them. Lawyers will not challenge a judge who's making decisions that are in the worst interest of a child because they have other cases with that judge. They do not want to be disbarred. The judge can't be criminal. I mean, that's what our system says. How does a judge get into a place like that? He can't be a criminal. Well, I refer people to the Netflix series Peaky Blinders, because that's exactly what we're talking about in the modern era, what they portray in Peaky Blinders with respect to that kind of criminality. And I'm talking about racketeering, corruption, you know, in some cases money laundering, and a lot of cases money laundering, because I showed that this visitation supervisor came on Sonny Kelly's case, and that was where Sonny was forced to have somebody in the room with her supervising her visitation with her own child. Meanwhile, the husband has no supervised visitation, no oversight, no DCF people involved, and he's raping the child. And so the Sarno agency, this guy, Nick Sarno, you know, I pinned down that this guy is a criminal operator, and he had purchased a property in Florida based on the funds that he made in Sonny Kelly's case.
You say in the book that the Sarno company, basically Nicholas Sarno and James DeSanti, made $123,000
on Sonny Kelly. I think that was on Sonny Kelly's case, correct?
And getting back,
well, I just want to clarify, they didn't just make a lot of money. They were making a lot of money on multiple cases, but this was $123,000 they made on Sonny's case, if I remember correctly.
And they did not have really any credentials to be supervising children.
DeSantis was a former he was an ex-cop. I mean,
that's not much.
And I called him up. I got him on the phone one day, and I'm hesitating to state what I learned because I felt scared at the time, and I still worry that these guys are they're gonna retaliate for the publication of the book and for talking about them.
So ultimately, Sonny Kelly was left financially in shambles. She was penniless after
penniless.
After the Sarno company built $123,000 from her.
It wasn't only Sarno.
All the other things that she paid for.
Right, and the judge, Maureen Murphy, the judge in the case at the time liquidated all of Sonny's assets, everything. And she was a reasonably wealthy individual when the marriage started to split up. And this meant she had resources that both revolved around her relationship with her husband, but also resources that should have been considered her own. Everything was taken from her. For a while, she maintained the place in Connecticut where Max had a bedroom, and he used to come and sleep, or he slept there. He grew up there when they were married, but for a while after he was taken from her, she left the bedroom exactly as it was. And a lot of mothers will do this. It's too much to deal with. They leave the bedroom exactly as it is. They keep it clean, for example, but they don't change anything in the hopes or expectations that their children are coming back, or out of the absolute impossibility of dealing with the trauma, accepting the reality that their child that came up with their own body has been taken from them and they aren't going to see them again. And that's what happened with Max. Sonny has not seen Max Liberty.
You talk about, one of the things that really got me is Dr. Robson, who I just quoted. Now, he's with an organization called Institute for Living, and it appears that there were other people that were part of that particular institution that also played an integral role in the corruption of family courts.
The Institute for Living actually also had a deep connection to the Catholic Church, and it was a proven ring of pedophilia involving the Catholic Church, connected to what was in Connecticut as well as links to Boston. So the Institute of Living has it's very, again, I referenced that movie, I Care a Lot. Just watch that film. I'm not advocating you watch a film. I'm not advocating you buy my book. But if you watch the film, you get a sense of how this thing works and the kind of ethics and profiteering that go on, and how it can actually happen to somebody like Sonny Kelly, and what role an institution like the Institute for Living, very, very powerful, very, very powerful civil political institution, you know, kind of like, I don't even know how to refer what to compare it to. You know, it's not comparable to the World Bank. It's more comparable to like a department of some sort of a state department in Massachusetts or in Connecticut. It's not just the physical resources of the building. It's the powerful individuals that are working within, and their connections to society and media and politicians. I mean, bring out the case of Lisa Foley, which I discussed in the book. Her ex-husband was the guy who ran for governor or became governor of Connecticut. A lot of money involved in that case, and a lot of these same ties and the same, you know, general modus operandi. And I do point out, I contacted the media, and, you know, these guys that are supposed to be, people would come along and say, oh, that's, Sonny would contact them, and, oh, that's an awful story. I think I should do something about it. I have to do something about it. But then they get involved and they just suddenly go quiet. Everything would go black and they wouldn't communicate. And the story never got published, never got reported fairly.
I wrote a book called The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal, in which both state and federal authorities covered up a pedophile network. And there was actually corruption within the family court, because the ringleader, or one of the ringleaders, was getting kids from a foster home. And that had to be covered up too. And when I initially told people about this story in 2000, I stumbled across in 2002, they were very skeptical and incredulous. And now we have Jeffrey Epstein, and people are coming up to me and going, you know, you were right all those years ago. It's just taken a while. But like you, people that have read my book and been violated by the courts or some segment of the government, they contact me and they want me to help them. And there was a professor at a very prestigious university, and the same thing happened to her.
In California.
Her son was awarded to her husband, who was a pedophile. And she did everything in her power to negate that, but she just couldn't.
And she wasn't a drug addict.
She was not a drug addict. She had no criminal behavior whatsoever.
She had several higher degrees. She was a very well-educated person.
And what ultimately happened is the kid got awarded to the husband, and she started to do some things that were less than optimal. And I understand that if your kid is being awarded to someone who's abusing that child, you're going to get very upset and maybe say some things that further demonstrate that you're not sound of mind. And I mean, most mothers are going to react that way if their perpetrator husbands get custody, despite all the professionals involved. If the perpetrator husbands get custody of the child, I mean, how does the woman not be emotional and at times say some things or do some things that are kind of productive for her case? And then, as you were saying, then the psychologists just point to her, the lawyers point to her, and they say, see, she's crazy. And that has happened quite a bit too.
Well, they rely on that. The Fathers' Rights Network and the perpetrators of the abuse in family courts, in many cases, rely on the fact that the mother will appear, and I would correct your language that you said there. You said that it provides further evidence that the mother is crazy, but it really just provides further evidence, further material for them to use against a mother who they've made crazy and are persecuting in such a way that and so extreme. Imagine losing everything you have, including your child, And when you try to bring, it's not about having the facts. It's not about having evidence. It's not about having a video showing that your child is being raped. None of this matters. It's not justice. People have to understand. In this case that I looked into in Georgia, it's the courts are entirely criminal. It's not justice. And the mother is a lawyer. And as soon as she got involved in this thing, they started to go at her. And at first, you're like, oh, this can't be happening. No, they're just making a mistake. I've just got to show them that my ex-husband is actually raping my child. Once they see the evidence, it'll be fine. No. And that's why it's a mistake for any mother or parent involved in the family court system to believe that it's not going to happen to them, or to believe that it's just a matter of bringing forth more evidence, or it's just a matter of getting the right attorney or the right psychologist. Oh, finally, we got a psychologist who's going to speak up. Very, very, very few cases does anybody speak up justly and turn the situation around. There's a few, but there's not very many. And another thing is that even if a mother involved in the family court system gains full custody today, if her husband is still fighting her, there's probably a very good chance that that's all going to turn around at some point in the future. And she needs to be absolutely aware that it's not over. And you can't even say it's not over till it's over, because I mean, she may end up homeless, living in a car, and who wouldn't have a drink or a few drinks, some drugs, even if they don't do any of that, like Lori Handrahan from Maine. She didn't do any of that, and neither did the person you spoke about from California. These are mothers who were persecuted by a completely unjust system, who believed that they could prevail, but no matter what they did, they were beaten down. And they didn't resort to drugs, and they didn't resort to criminality, but they said and did things that make them appear crazy. But man, I tell you, I don't, just look up what I said in front of the judiciary hearing in Connecticut, that what I would do if you did this to my child.
The woman that I was referring to, she was a tenured professor.
And same with Lori Handrahan.
Yeah, and she lost her job, and she was living with her father when she contacted me. And I'm familiar with Lori Handrahan's case too. How can we turn this around? How is it? Do you have any suggestions or ideas of how we can turn this around?
Let the Udabobber out of prison. No.
Well, I think he would be limited, but
I was trying to be funny, but only partially am I not speaking what I really believe. I mean, look at Peaky Blinders. If people didn't watch that series, I'm not advocating for a series, but the criminality that goes on in these real world is what you see in these films. Look at I Care a Lot. Look at those movies and get a sense of what we're talking about here, because in some cases, people who've challenged the family courts have been eliminated. What can we do? Well, first of all,
go ahead.
People have to realize that the public has to come awake that this is a legitimate human rights crime going along against mothers. And the problem is it's complicated, like so many things these days. The whole mothers in family court thing, because it's silent, because people don't want to believe it, because it's so organized on so many different ways that it's not easily and readily accessible. There's a snowballing effect that more and more books get published, more and more people speak out. A judge here or there speaks out against what they know they were part of. And finally, at some point, you'd think that the public would become aware that this is a criminal institution, criminal organization, but the federal government is involved, and so is the state governments. And so it becomes a question of how do you turn something like that around? But it's comparable to the civil rights movement. How do you take a situation where you've got Black families being lynched by mobs in the Deep South, for over 100 years, over hundreds of years, but up until the 1940s, 1950s. And if they try to speak out against it, they're absolutely silenced. And if they do anything to try to fight back, they're portrayed as the perpetrator. So it's a blame the victim scenario. The mothers that this is happening to are being blamed for being hysterical about the fact that they've lost their child to somebody who's destroying the life of that child and themselves, and really who belongs in prison. So how do you turn that around? The movie No Way Out But One, the documentary made by a mother from Florida who ended up, her only way out was she realized she was smart. She got out of the country. She had passports. Many mothers don't have passports for their children. She took her child out of the country. She applied for asylum in Britain, and magically she got asylum in Britain. Other governments now are not giving asylum to mothers who run with their children. They're extraditing them and putting the mother in prison and giving the child to DCFs or to the grandmother on the father's side or one of the perpetrators. But No Way Out But One, that was her choice. In many cases, I say to the mother, can you run? Can you, we really need a network like the Underground Railroad, which was channeling, funneling, and helping to support runaway slaves to become free. We need the same thing for mothers to get free from family courts. But how do you organize such a thing in this day and age? If a mother does run with her child, there's surveillance cameras everywhere. There's so many cases of mothers that did try to run with their child or children because they had no other avenue for justice or liberation or protecting their child. That's why we call them protective mothers. They're protecting their child from a violent situation, and they have a right to do so. But everything has been turned on its head, and it makes them look like they're the criminals. So how do you turn that around? So the other thing is, if the media would carry some of these stories, but what the media says is, oh no, he said, it's Kramer versus Kramer. He said versus she said, and I can't figure out which is right. But you know what? A good journalist can figure out what the truth is. Just like you were able to look into the Franklin scandal, and I was able to document Liberty versus Liberty and 20 other cases.
What I noticed with the Franklin scandal and then with Epstein is major legal aberrations occur when a network is being covered up. I'm not saying that all the aberrations that you addressed in your book imply that there's a network at work, but what I am saying is that from my experience, when you see major legal aberrations, like the grand jury that looked into Epstein came back and said that Jeffrey Epstein hadn't abused a single minor, even though he'd been abusing minors for well over a decade at that point, well over about 15 years. Now, and they were protecting the person that ran that grand jury was protecting that network. And then ultimately the feds got involved and they had a list of 36 victims, but they were also protecting that network. And you talked about people are incredulous when you say stuff like this. And it's very difficult when you see these major aberrations go down and you want to do something about it. I mean, I wrote a book. I could not get it published in the mainstream media. Mm-hmm. And Wikipedia is controlled by these very unscrupulous editors, if you want to call them editors, and they make my book look nonsensical. And hours and hours and hours of battles have been waged to make that Wikipedia page read somewhat as if it's reality. But these editors will not let that happen. They've got complete control of that page and they've got it locked down. And I've always thought the reason why there's such a battle, there's been such a battle to make sure that that Wikipedia page remains completely fictitious, is because it's still going on. And Jeffrey Epstein proved that. Because when I was originally pitching the Franklin scandal, people were saying, well, this can't possibly be going on now, and editors and publishers. And at that very moment, Jeffrey Epstein was trafficking children. So that is a problem that we have, and it's an endemic problem. And I think family courts are part of the problem. I think CPS is part of the problem. And there's a lot of tentacles to this.
Well, Sonny Kelly went to the FBI. Other Connecticut mothers went to the FBI. This woman in Oklahoma, I believe she went to the FBI. I personally went to the Department of the Attorney General's office in Oklahoma. And these guys they sent out these two investigators, and they sat down and we had a chat, me and two other mothers advocating on behalf of this woman and her two daughters in Oklahoma. This was in February. And I wasn't getting paid for this. I have no skin in the game otherwise, except that I care about these two little girls and their mother. And it's a particularly horrible case. And as I said, she has 4 lawyers working for her pro bono because it's a particularly horrible case. And these two guys, these two investigators, these big investigator, police officer, detective kind of guys come out and sit down working for the Attorney General, and they start taking notes and asking questions. But as soon as we name the case, they're going to go back to the judge or the DCF and look into it. And as soon as DCF or the judge or somebody gets word of the fact that the mother is speaking out, the case, they come down on top of her again and take more steps to prevent her from, to try to silence her, because it's a network of power, corruption, and profiteering. And so these two investigators, we sat there, playing a, it's a game theory situation. You're trying to outwit, outthink, outsmart, outgame your opponent. In this case, two investigators who are supposed to be supporting the public interest and truth and justice and all that, but really they say their hands are tied, or they say, well, we have to deal with DCF. We have to go look at the case. What case is it? It's a no-win situation, and they can't be, if they take the wrong step or step out of line, they're going to lose their jobs, and they know that, and they've seen it happen to other people. But you have to wonder why. Why do people put up with it? Why do people participate in it? And I think it comes down to fear, and it comes down to power. And, they have a certain amount of power they don't want to lose. And they aren't willing to challenge a situation on behalf of a 6 and a 9-year-old girl who are being raped by multiple perpetrators in their own city. And to me, it's unfathomable. So, and it's, again, I watch the movie. I Care a Lot. They really nail it, except for, the part about how the people that are perpetrating the thing are the people they choose as victims are actually organized criminals, and I Care a Lot. But it really nails it, the way it works and all the different pieces. And yeah.
Here's a quote from your book. The United States today can and does include the highest echelons of government, and includes some of our most privileged social elite who went to the very best schools and are considered highly respected community leaders. So basically what you're saying is that the upper echelon of our society perpetrates these crimes.
Absolutely.
Or allows them to be perpetrated.
Absolutely. It's perpetrators and participants at the highest levels of government. Is the earth flat? I mean, the picture behind you that I'm looking at suggests that the earth is flat. Do you believe the earth is flat? So the whole premise of a conspiracy theorist is that, of using the argument conspiracy theory, is that somebody like me or you is going to look absolutely crazy, because it can't be doctors, and it can't be pediatricians, and it can't be counselors and guardian ad litems and lawyers. They're not all corrupt criminals, and they're not all corrupt. But the fact is, it's happening. And, understanding how it happens is what I tried to do in my book. I laid out how it happened, the players that got involved, when they got involved, what they did, when they turned their backs on Sonny, or just took a party line, or just started to repeat, verbatim what they were being told was going on, which was that Sonny was making it all up. And do I believe that money changes hands? Do I believe that judges are paid off? Absolutely. What about the mortgage crisis? How many Americans who are listening to this have gone through the mortgage crisis or lost their properties because of a mortgage to a bank? How many of them realize that their mortgage was criminal, that they were paying? How many people who've lost their properties were paying their mortgages and still had their property taken away? Now, if you look into that, you can come to an institution that protects these trading in properties behind the scenes, which are paying off. The banks are paying off people to make sure that these big banks get these properties, profiteer from turning the mortgage over, and it's all hidden. And that's because people are making money and they're getting power and money out of the situation. And it's the same with family court. And it's the same with the FBI. You know?
Thank you so much, Keith, for being on the Nick Bryant podcast.
Have a lovely day.
Yeah, you too.